Well, hey everybody, good morning. Welcome to Covenant Church. My name is Pastor David. I'm so glad that you are with us, and honestly, it's going to be an incredible day. I know that I'm not here in person this morning. All right, that's no surprise. I'm up here on a screen. But for about the past 9 months, we have had this family vacation scheduled. And to be very honest with you, even though there's a part of me that really wishes that I was here with you in this theater, there's a big part of me and my family that need a vacation right now. And so our amazing staff, our elders, they encourage me not to cancel my vacation and instead to just address you guys on video this morning. Now, I know that this morning you were filled in on some of the next steps, the things to expect in the coming weeks. And so I'm glad that you're here. It's going to be an amazing journey that God takes us on. I really believe that. And I don't anticipate that we're really going to have any more of these video sermons coming up in the coming weeks or months. So I don't want you to worry about that at all. But for today, you are stuck with this supersized version of my big bald head, okay? So prepare yourselves now. Now, do you guys want to know what one of my life's ambitions is? It's honestly something that I've been praying for years. It's just a simple prayer. I pray this often. God, I want to see you move. And by that, what I mean is that I want to be a part of something so incredible that it can't be explained apart from the presence of God. I want to see God move in an undeniable way while I'm alive. And although moments like these are difficult for us as a church, when we don't know what's next, what I actually believe is that moments like that, when we see God move in an undeniable way, moments like that often are birthed out of moments like this, that cause us to search out, to pray, to beg God for His will. Moments like these force us to set aside our notions of what the future is and instead ask God to paint us the picture that He wants to paint instead. Now, I don't think it's an accident that we're going to be walking through John chapter 18 this month. I don't think that there are any accidents with God. And this has been planned out for months and years. And as we go through this chapter, which covers the betrayal, the arrest, the trial of Jesus, the uncertainty and the fear of His disciples in the face of the unknown, I think it's going to be an amazing month. An amazing month as we learn about how Jesus responded during this time of His life. Now, last week we covered chapter 18. We started in verse 1, okay? And we talked about Jesus staring down that garden path, knowing that there is nowhere to go but forward. We talked about Jesus and how He had developed these habits over His life so that in that moment, His cup overflowed with God's grace, thanks to His habits built over years, habits like prayer and time alone with God. And now today, I want us to see that this path that Jesus walked, He actually walked willingly out of His great love for us. And so let's open up our Bibles. You'll see it on the screen as well. Turn to John chapter 18, and we're going to start in verse 3. Here's what we read. John 18, verse 3. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, he went there into the garden, with lanterns and weapons and torches. And then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, he came forward and he said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." And then Jesus said to them, "I am He." Judas, who betrayed Him, was standing with them. And when Jesus said, "I am He," they drew back and they fell to the ground. And so He asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" They said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am He. So if you seek me, let these men go." Okay. I was in high school when I met somebody famous. I went to the Hall of Fame game up in Canton. And just in the middle of cheering for this pointless preseason game and having a good time with my dad, I looked to my right and unbelievably, there was John Elway walking up the steps next to me. And I kind of freaked out and I yelled, "John, John!" And I reached out and I shook John Elway's hand. Now, for those of you who grew up like a football fanatic like me, shaking John Elway's hand, one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, was like a moment, okay? I was pretty awestruck. And it was crazy how big this dude's hand was. It was like if I took my normal baseball glove and then I started shaking your hand, that's kind of what it felt like. Now, I realize for those of you who aren't football fans, my famous story of meeting somebody is not that impressive. Especially when you look at like when the Beatles first came to America. Have you ever seen those old videos of people screaming and just absolutely losing their minds? Or I've seen Elvis. Girls would literally faint in his presence. Unbelievable what happens when you meet somebody like that. But what we see in this passage is like a whole other category. It's not that these men who came to arrest Jesus were awestruck by his fame or his presence. What we see is something very different. What we see is that when Jesus introduces himself, they were compelled by the power of the great I am. It's one thing to see Jesus in the garden that night, but it's another to recognize that it was the great I am that was in that garden. 6 times in the Gospel of John, Jesus uses the name I am to refer to himself. Now that might seem odd to us. I introduced myself at the beginning of this. I said, I'm David. But for a Hebrew, an Israelite, someone that grew up in the Jewish faith, the great I am is a very important title. You see, it all goes back to the very beginning of Scripture. God has been using this title, I am, for himself. And probably the most famous time in which that's used is with Moses in Exodus chapter 3. You see, Moses had been asked by God from a burning bush to go to Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world at that point, and tell him that he needs to let the Israelite people go. Okay, let me repeat that. A burning bush in a desert says Moses' name. He goes over. The burning bush, the voice, says that he needs to now go to the most powerful man in the world and tell him to let all of the Israelite Hebrew slaves go. So Moses is sort of freaking out at this point. And he asks this burning bush, like, who is it that I should tell Pharaoh has sent me? In essence, which god out of all the gods that the Egyptians might recognize should I say sent me? Should I tell him that Osiris sent me? Osiris, the Lord and judge of the dead to the Egyptians. Or maybe it's Ra, the great and powerful sun god. Is that who I should tell Pharaoh he needs to listen to? But God, from the midst of that bush, tells Pharaoh, you tell him that I am has sent you. Don't you confuse me with any of their weak, false gods, he says. I am. I am uncreated. I am eternal. I am always existing, all powerful, God says to Moses. And so in the garden, when Jesus asks, who do you seek? And then they say Jesus, and he responds, I am he. What you see is that the I am was responding. And this is what I really want you to see. This is at the heart of it today. In that garden, through chapter 18, through this arrest, through this trial, I want you to see and know that Jesus was not some helpless victim. He's not a brave martyr. He is the great I am. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the maker of heaven and earth. The one who spoke to Moses from that burning bush and who delivered Egypt, the Israelites from Egypt with signs and wonders. It was Jesus, the I am, that led the people of Israel as a pillar of cloud by day and a fire by night. It was Jesus that walked with Joshua and the people as they walked into the promised land. And we see at the end of Scripture and at the end of time that it will be Jesus returning on a white horse with the hosts of heaven as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He's going to be wearing a robe that is dipped in blood, and that blood doesn't symbolize the blood that he shed on the cross for us. The blood on his robe is the blood of a righteous judge who has destroyed the enemies of God and the agents of evil. The great I am was being arrested? No. The great I am willingly submitted. Jesus wasn't arrested. Jesus willingly submitted. I'm not a huge fan of UFC, but I have watched enough to know that it is brutal. It is man against man or woman against woman, and only the strong will survive. And what I see is that in UFC, I've seen some of these brutal submission moves, right? These moves where these people are battling on the ground and then somebody flips over and all of a sudden somebody's arm is bending back at a crazy angle and they're tapping and until the weaker has submitted to the stronger. That's one way that you can look at submission. But biblically, submission is a different thing. In premarital counseling, it's something that we talk about a lot. Mutual submission is the goal. In Ephesians, we see that the goal in a marriage is two people submitting to one another out of an act of love. And that's what true submission is. It's an act of love. It's not a stronger person forcing a weaker person. It's not coercing someone or manipulating a situation into someone thinking that they're submitting. No. Real submission is an act of love. In fact, using your strength or coercing or manipulating, that actually negates the type of love that we're talking about. That's a perversion of love. And what we see is that Jesus' submission was willing. He knew in advance exactly what was coming and what would happen. He tells his disciples in John chapter 10. I'm going to turn to John chapter 10. It's one of my favorite passages, starting in verse 11. Here's what Jesus says to his disciples. He says, I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays his life down for his sheep. Just down a little bit further in verses 17 and 18, we see, for this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, then I might take it up again. No one takes it from me. I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it up again. This is the charge I've received from my Father. Nobody forced or coerced or made Jesus take on the cross. This was a path that he willingly walked, and we can see that he willingly walked this path because the moment that he declared, I am in the garden, the power of God was on display as the men were knocked over backward against their will into the ground, which is unbelievable. And so I want you to grasp that as Jesus allows himself to be arrested, to be struck in the face and spit upon by the servants of the high priest, as Jesus allows himself to be questioned by the godlessness of the leaders of Israel. Not for a minute did that power of the great I am leave him. Pastor John MacArthur says it like this: as God incarnate Jesus was always in absolute control of the events of his life. Far from being an accident, Jesus' sacrifice and death was the primary reason that he took on human form in the first place. It is the pinnacle of redemptive history. Why would the great I Am allow himself to be humiliated in a garden, to be spit upon, to be ridiculed? Well, we catch a glimpse of his reasoning and of God's character in this one verse in chapter 18. We're going to turn back here real quick. I don't want you to miss this. In chapter 18, in verses 6 and 7, we see this reasoning, okay? Chapter 18, let me find it, verses 6 and 7. When he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. So there's his power on display. And so he asked them again, who do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go. And then verse 9 says, this was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one. Why did Jesus submit in that garden? It was because he was the good shepherd who loved his sheep. You see that. So if you seek me, let these men go. It was out of his love for his disciples, and it was out of his love for us. Now, it was just a few weeks ago, maybe 3 or 4 back, that I sat in this theater, not in church, but to watch Top Gun Maverick, which blew my mind. Unbelievable movie. All right, seriously, one of the best movies I've seen in a long time. Fantastic. Now, I was in awe of the power of these planes, the skill of the pilots, their boldness, their daring, and even more blown away when I read up on like how this movie was made later on. The fact that they were actually in planes, and that was actual footage, not CGI. That just mind-blowing, okay? But what really spoke to me, and what I think was at the heart of this movie, one of the most powerful parts, it was the fact that Tom Cruise, Maverick, he was unwilling to design a mission that would not protect his pilots. Maverick was unwilling to put his pilots' lives on the line before he put his own on the line. And it spoke to me because it's this small echo of the gospel story. The fact that Jesus initiates the confrontation in the garden. There are these men, and it's chaotic, and they're approaching with torches in the night, and there's weapons, and Jesus walks right up to them, and he says, who are you looking for? Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, that's me. Let these men go. Jesus, to the very end, was a good shepherd protecting his sheep. And here's what I want you to know. He is still that good shepherd protecting you and me through all of life's fears and challenges that we face. Remember from last week, I talked about how God is in control, and I gave this example of riding in that car, that go-kart with my dad, and looking over and seeing my dad on the steering wheel, and it allowed me to take my hands off. God is in control. Our good shepherd is protecting and watching over us, and he'll watch over and protect you throughout your life as well. When we submit ourselves to him, when we choose to follow him, to submit our lives to Jesus, our good shepherd protects us. But why? Where does that come from? It is the great love of God that motivates him. And just as Jesus demonstrated his love and protection for his disciples in the garden, his love continued to be demonstrated as he inevitably walked down that garden path toward a punishment and a death that I deserved, that you deserved, but that he took. And that's the heart of the gospel message. That's what John, the author, is trying to help us to see. In John chapter 3, verse 16, most of us know this word. this passage. I'm not even going to turn to it. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever should believe in him won't perish but will have eternal life. Why would a sovereign God, the great I Am, allow himself to be arrested when his very name, spoken in power, caused men to fall on their backsides? It's his love for us. If you don't hear anything else that I say today, here's what I need you to hear and understand. The love that God has for you, his creation, is far beyond what you can even imagine. I know that this world, it tells us to take our value in things like our profession. It tells us to derive our value by looking at our bank account or our 401k. The world tells us to derive our value based on how successful we are or how many friends that we have. But if you don't hear anything else from me today, I want you to know and hear that the love of God should be the foundation upon which you build your self-worth. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. I've heard it said that when we read John 3:16, instead of just saying, so God so loved the world, that we should be reading it another way. We should be reading, for God so, and just keep going, loved the world, that he gave his one and only son. Now I'm out of breath a little bit, okay? God's love for you and me is so great. It's so above and beyond what we can even imagine that it caused him, the great I Am, to willingly submit to his creation. And in John 3:17, we read that God did not just send his son into the world to condemn it, but so that the world might be saved through Jesus Christ. Our lives have meaning and purpose and value because we were endowed with that by our Creator. I can love others because God has first poured his love into me. God's love is reaching out to you today. And I don't know who needs to hear this morning or who needs to let this sink in, but you need to know and recognize that if the world has been telling you that you're worthless or that you're not worth it or you're not enough, don't believe the lie of the enemy. Look to the life of the great I Am in the garden and see his love demonstrated for you. A love that caused him to willingly walk that garden path. That caused him to willingly submit himself. You are loved by God, and God's love is reaching out to you right now, today.